Hello everyone for Hello everyone for joining us on the Cloud Native Podcast. This is your host for the Cloud Native Podcast, Saim Safdar, and thank you everyone once again for tuning into this episode. And after a month of struggle, I'm finally able to meet the maintainers of most demanding technology in the cloud native these days. And if you have guessed it right, we are talking about GitOps and Argo project. And this means I'm ready for a lot of interested questions on the chat. And after the next 30 minutes, I hope you will be get up to speed with some of the toughest concepts around GitOps, Argo, and let's go straight to my guest on this episode, Michael Crenshaw. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us today. So let's
Thank you for
introduce
having
yourself
me.
to the audience first.
Sure. So I'm Michael Crenshaw. I work at Intuit as a senior software engineer on our Argo CD team. My team contributes pretty heavily to the open source side, but we also help maintain Intuit's internal build and deployment tools.
Yes, thank you very much because I'm actually waiting for the day because this channel lacked content around Argo City and the GitOps, and finally I'm able to meet you. But it is a day one of learning the GitOps. So let's start the agenda for the day. And just a quick introduction of Argo C GitOps. GitOps is a software engineering practice that uses a Git repository as its single source of truth. Teams commit declarative configuration into Git, and these configurations are used to create environments needed for the continuous delivery process. And a quick intro of Argo CD. Argo CD is a Kubernetes native continuous deployment tool. Unlike external CD tools that only enable push-based deployment, Argo CD can pull updated code from Git repositories and deploy it directly to Kubernetes resources. A quick intro. And now, Michael, first you tell about your journey, how you actually get introduced to GitOps, and when you actually first started your contribution to the Argo CD project.
Sure. So my intro to GitOps came from a place where I did know GitOps before. So I was very happy to move into that world. At my first tech job, when we deployed new versions of our web service, we pulled old clusters or old servers out of a cluster, deployed new software, put the new software in, watched for errors. It was all very manual and almost is reminiscent of using FTP to upload new PHP files for a web service. So I got introduced to GitOps at a company where I was contracting with Bayer Crop Sciences. And they already had set up a really nice Kubernetes environment and had a mono repo with all of their deployments of all their different services defined in Kubernetes manifests. So at Bayer, I got introduced to GitOps using Argo CD, and then I started actually contributing to Argo workflows before CD because we were writing CI pipelines with workflows. And actually, that company is how I got introduced to you because my coworker Zubair Hawk introduced us, and he helps me a lot with setting up those CI pipelines and workflows.
Yes, absolutely. And Zubair, actually, I think he's watching us from the chat as well, might be. So
Nice.
he's the person behind we are doing the live stream. So we have just created some small slides for the people to understand what GitOps is, and we will ask questions during the live stream. I think, like Michael, if we can talk about the previously, then when there is a no GitOps, actually, I think the whole evolution is started from the infrastructure as a code. Like we write uh, code to build our infrastructure. So can you draw some pointer to the public, like what how the infrastructure codes works and what they are lacking before the GitOps?
Sure. So it's funny. I kind of hopped across infrastructure as code in my development. So like I say, early on, it was basically FTP to a web server, and then straight to GitOps. But in between, there's been this whole era of defining infrastructure, web services, databases, etc., as code instead of like manually running commands to set up all those things. So when I think infrastructure as code, I think more like Terraform, which is still kind of declarative, but there's still a lot of state involved. So when you run a Terraform apply, you've defined a big file describing all the things that you need to set up your infrastructure. And then Terraform does the work of communicating with your cloud provider to actually get those things provisioned, get them running, get them connected. And I guess GitOps is the evolution of that, where you go from defining and describing your infrastructure as code and deploying that from a CLI locally to now you define all of that in a Git repository or some other version source of truth, and you have something else do the deploying for you. And that's what Argo CD is. It's the thing that does the deploying for you.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And Michael, can you can you add a new, go to the next slides? And I think, like, if we talk about like, and one more, and I think infrastructure is all already about not just infrastructure, is or is about network as a code, the policy as a code, and security as a code, and configuration as a code. And in the Kubernetes, I have talked a lot about this because in Kubernetes, every object you created is a YAML. Is ingress is a YAML, deployment is a YAML, service is a YAML, pod is a YAML, everything is a YAML. And people realize, why not we put this stuff into the Git and then do the infrastructure as code things on top of it. So I think it's how the revolution started. And also, Michael, as we talk about the Terraform, and we go to the next slide, I think there is a mention like this is I heard a lot about. Like we have GitOps. There's a basically three, four pillars in it. Like you have infrastructure as a code, version control, pull and merge request, and CI/CD pipeline. So now, Michael, can you tell people in the GitOps world, like, is it a new way of thinking, or still we are leveraging our existing knowledge of CI/CD pipeline and building actually something that is missing on that point? Because we talk about push-based deployment, but
Mhm.
GitOps is all about the pull-based deployment. So how these two models are different from each other?
Yeah, so in a push-based deployment, basically you have a human who makes the decision, we're going to deploy some change to our infrastructure. And usually that mechanism is a local CLI or potentially some web service, which basically runs a CLI in order to make the changes in your cloud provider or potentially some hosting service that hosts some files. So that is, you make the changes and push them out to the things that actually make your applications work. Um, with pull-based, it eliminates the necessity of like triggering each of those individual actions. There is something that runs in the actual destination in the same place where your application runs, and it's constantly looking for changes that you're making to your configuration. And when it sees that you've pushed to, say, a Git repository, it will see if that configuration is different from what is currently live, and then it will reconcile and make those the same.
Yes, absolutely. I think in the slide there are some. If you go to some of the last slide, there's a yes. We talk about this like you have a Terraform, YAML, anything, but I
Mhm.
think when you try to test it locally, it just runs on your machine. And if
Yes.
you save it in a Git repository, now this is stored centrally, but everybody can access to it and they can deploy manual stuff to build the AWS infrastructure in the cloud on running in the Kubernetes cluster. And slowly, if we move up, if we go ahead into the slide, we can see that for the infrastructure as code, there is no review, there's no approval request, there's a more pull or merge request, no code reviews, no collaboration. And that is basically the pain point on that process. And there's actually a no automated test because we know if people can write bad YAMLs, everybody can write some typos and errors in there. This is absolutely. And absolute. And Michael, I think for the people might be listening to us, they can understand if they went through this stage of the infrastructure as code, they can see all these kind of challenges. But people, I think I heard this question a lot in the social media, and people are saying, do you think the GitOps is also for the small company, for the small startups who are actually using infrastructure as code to build infrastructure, but their infrastructure is not a very heavy or sophisticated. But do you think these people could leverage or even try to think about adopting the GitOps principles?
It's a really good question, and one that a friend who's currently working at kind of a mid-sized startup right now asked me recently. My conclusion was, if you have a team that's already kind of familiar with GitOps and maybe they've used a tool like Argo CD, then it might make sense to start from day one with setting up a GitOps system. Um, it is a bit of overhead though. So if you don't have that foundation, then I think it's perfectly fine to, set up your infrastructure using AWS CLI or kubectl from your local machine just to get something started. And then over time sort of progress to, okay, now we're going to store this information in Git, but maybe we use a GitHub action to push changes instead of using a pull model. It's just, two-line GitHub action, very simple. And then over time, eventually find your way to doing full GitOps, because GitOps really shines in having an audit trail and automating a lot of things that you would have to do manually. But if it's just a few people at a startup, then having an audit trail isn't really super important, and you know how to do the individual manual actions, so it's not a big deal. So I'm not too opinionated on that. I like starting early with GitOps, and I think that it's a nice ideal to shoot for, but you don't have to.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And another like on the another question like how the traditional CI/CD tooling and the mindset is different from the GitOps, because people have their existing knowledge, because we try to map our existing knowledge to the new tooling. So it's actually a question about how we can map our existing knowledge of CI/CD to the GitOps.
Yeah, so I think that traditional CI/CD tooling tends to rely on services that sort of sit outside of your actual deployment environment. And they tend to be fairly unopinionated, and they tend to be very push focused. So take, for example, Jenkins. You can configure it to take information from a Git repository and deploy it to Kubernetes. But it's not really geared towards that. You do have to write quite a bit of stuff to make that happen. And we do that at Intuit in a lot of places. Um, so when you move to GitOps in sort of in the Kubernetes world, Kubernetes is already really geared for GitOps because everything is declarative. Everything is YAML, and it can be stored very nicely in a GitHub repository and versioned and diffed. Um, Tools that do GitOps in the Kubernetes ecosystem, they they're just like anything else you're deploying. Argo CD is just YAML manifests. You can deploy Argo CD with Argo CD, and then it pulls your manifests and deploys them. So it feels more. I think it feels easier to get started if you're already in the Kubernetes world with GitOps versus tacking on something that really knows nothing about Kubernetes and is just a generic actions runner.
Yes, absolutely, and I think like as you like we recently mentioned, like Kubernetes is all YAML. Every resource you created on the this is all YAML, and now you're thinking about why not put these YAML into the Git repository, and then you compare your actual state with the desired state, like what it is in the Git and what is in my cluster. If those tools are matching this thing, this means you are good to go. And if there are drift between both of them, you can reconcile or you can sync between, and the state go to the desired state as well. But I think like because we talk about Kubernetes, and the natural question came into the people mind, because when I first started learning about GitOps, this came into my mind like Is GitOps is just for Kubernetes? As of today, we know GitOps can extend to other, uh, can run in outside of the Kubernetes cluster as well. But how you can answer this question, like how is GitOps just for Kubernetes?
It's not. It happens to work really well with Kubernetes, and it's because Kubernetes is declarative. So the GitOps working group has produced a document that basically lays out the four principles of GitOps. And the first one is GitOps is all about dealing with declarative resources, um, because you're describing a desired state, and that's exactly what declarative systems do. You describe what you want, and then it is up to some other system to determine how to get that for you. So I, there are other systems that are also defined declaratively, and those could benefit from GitOps. But Kubernetes just really shines because everything is declarative.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And another question on top of this, like we know, like what is the prerequisite for the people to jump into the GitOps world? Because I think it's really quite a complicated topic, a question to answer. Because we need containers, and to contain to be become the container expert, you need to learn Linux first, because Linux is a forefront of the container technology. And then you go to the container, you need orchestration in there. But when you go to the GitOps, people start to think about what are the basic knowledge I need to have before jumping into it. So can you answer this question, like what is the prerequisite knowledge for the companies, for the people, for the industrial, for the tech people? How to actually find the prerequisite knowledge first?
Sure. So I should talk about GitOps alone at first, and then GitOps in Kubernetes. So the prerequisite knowledge to kind of demonstrate GitOps is, one, you need to know what Git is. You need to know how to push to a Git repository. And two, you need to know how to pull from a Git repository and then do something as a result of that pull. So this could be as simple as you write hello world.py and you push that to an external repo. And then you just write a Python script on your local computer that pulls from that repository and constantly pulls down the hello.py file and then runs it. So you've done GitOps. You've done a constant pull. If you pushed a change to your Git repository, you'd see that run locally. That's all GitOps really is. In the Kubernetes world, there's a bit more prerequisite knowledge. So it's helpful to know basically how to do a hello world in Kubernetes. Run a local cluster like Minikube or K3D. There are many options. So spin up a local cluster and then run a job or a pod, something that says hello world, just so you understand, okay, I can run code on this thing. And then you sort of need to understand the different basic resources which Kubernetes defines, so deployments, services, pods, etc. Once you know those things, then you know how to deploy them. So you use kubectl apply. It's just Kubernetes command line interface. And the way you deploy Argo CD is with kubectl apply f, and you can just pass it the URL of our basic install manifests. And we have instructions that say, run this command, and then run one or two other commands, and you're looking at a user interface. Once you're at the user interface, you'll start seeing things that look familiar, like you'll see pods running, and they'll be represented as little nodes on a graph. So it doesn't take a whole lot of prerequisite knowledge to get bootstrapped and just get to a basic functioning GitOps system. From there, you do have to start learning about, okay, how do these containers work? What are the different configuration options for a Kubernetes deployment? But that all falls in pretty naturally. Things break, you Google it and you fix it. There's a lot of good help out there for this stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And Argo is a huge community. A lot of the folks working on it, a lot of the great companies or investing time and all these kind of things. And also like Michael, if you go to the some of the next slides, because there is a
Yeah,
push base there are some pull. Yes, we talk
it's
about
kind of
this.
push based. Yeah.
Yes, that's a push base, absolutely.
Hmm.
And that we talk about is a no audit trail, who can do what, because these are the manual stuff that the
Yep.
infrastructure say. And all the deployments is manual, but GitOps is two things, I guess. It's infrastructure as code plus a CI/CD pipeline. And now I think we talk about like hosted on the Git repository. And if you go to the some of the next slide, I think there's a pull-based deployment model. There's one
Hmm.
actually. I think now is we're treating the code as same way as the application code as infrastructure code. Now we have change in place, then it's go to the CI/CD pipeline, then approve it, and
Hmm.
then finally the CD pipeline is merged. And on the next slide, I guess, yes, then we deploy it to the environment. I think the final slide might be on the there's a push base
Hmm.
deployment we discussed, and I think the
Yeah, so you're
next slide.
using Jenkins or GitLab. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a pull-based deployment, and that's I'm trying to understand like where, because we started another question, like when people try to think about what the agent is running on the Kubernetes cluster, and these agent or Argo CD or Flux or they're on what are the things they manage, because I can put anything in the GitHub repository. There might be a, not a job of the agent to manage all things. So it's I think it's
Hmm.
we have to understand what are the things that the Argo CD or other GitOps tooling actually manage when they look at the GitHub repository.
Yeah. So the things that it makes sense for Argo CD to manage are resources that are, I'll use this term and then try to explain it as best I can. They are root resources. So something like a deployment, you will define in your Kubernetes manifest in your Git repository, but that deployment is not the final form of your service. Kubernetes will see that that deployment resource has been deployed, and then it will create things called replica sets, and then from those replica sets, it'll create pods. And none of that's really represented in the manifests in your Git repository. That's all spun up and created by Kubernetes controllers, which manage the deployment resources. So Argo CD is in charge of getting the base resource out or the root resource, and then other things are in charge of creating the children resources. And Argo CD will still represent those child resources for you in its user interface and via CLI, but it's not in charge of really managing it per se. Other things that it may not make sense to manage, well, I'm a big fan of sealed secrets. So with a sealed secret, you encrypt something, you put that in your Git repository, you deploy it, and then a controller in Kubernetes turns that sealed secret, which no one can read or understand, into a standard Kubernetes secret, which is actually usable for things like accessing external services. It doesn't make sense for Argo CD to manage the secret because then you'd have to put the secret in Git, and that's not really a safe place for most secrets.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That's a that's a very very important point, because I think we will discuss in the future as well, because we try to team up against some of the demos and all these kind of stuff. But I think the Algo is a huge, and it's not just a one piece. There are several pieces in it, and before we have the time, we can discuss this, because we have Argo CT, we have Argo rollouts, Argo events, and Argo workflow. So can you briefly explain all three other technologies that's bundled together with Argo ecosystem?
Yes. So when you hear Argo workflows, think maybe like Jenkins or GitHub Actions, but it's all Kubernetes native. So you're defining a series of steps or potentially a graph of steps that end up being executed as Kubernetes pods. So it does what it says. It executes a workflow, and it's used a lot for ML ops, big heavyweight processes. And like I say, at Bayer, I used it to create a CI system, something that builds images and pushes them to an image repository. So that's workflows. Rollouts builds on the standard Kubernetes deployment resource, but instead of just changing from one image to another image, Rollouts gives you the ability to, for example, do a canary deployment where you expose the new image to some subset of traffic, say 10% of traffic, and then you can potentially run some kind of analysis on the pods that are receiving traffic for the new images and determine, okay, do we proceed with this rollout or do we think there's a problem and need to revert? So it's just an advanced deployment. And then finally, Argo Events is all about receiving information from an external queue or a webhook, just something outside of Kubernetes, or potentially sometimes even inside Kubernetes, but a series of events, and then performing actions based on those events. So again, with CI, I had an Argo event set up to listen for a GitHub webhook, and when a pull request was opened on a GitHub repository, it would kick off an Argo workflow, run some tests, and communicate back to the GitHub API whether the PR is mergeable. So those are the other three of the Argo quadruplets.
Yes, absolutely. And we have one question for Kai Hansen. So I think this is a very advanced one, but we will try to answer. Do you have any thoughts on the new templating tool being created? Corwell, YTT, Grafana, Tanka, and how might these interact with Argo going forward?
I do have thoughts. I think they're really, really exciting. So Argo CD currently supports three different config management tools natively: Customize, Helm, and JSON. Uh, that covers a lot of users, but it doesn't cover them all. And a lot of folks are really interested in YTT and Tonka support. So with the next Argo CD release 2.6, we're introducing even more features for Argo CD's config management plugin system. And it's still early days, but over time, our hope is that people will be able to build config management plugins that provide YTT and Tonka and other config management tool support. And those can be managed and maintained by the community. And then folks can opt into installing whichever tools they want or need. I, for example, have seen a couple repositories implementing Helm file support. So those plugins exist already. They don't tie into Argo CD quite as nicely as Helm, Customize, and JSON, but we're slowly building out those integrations so that you can get a really first-class experience with those other tools.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think like the configuration is quite configuration like customize or Helm or APT or YTT or Tanka. But I think there is a one other one is called KPT, I guess. That is
Yeah.
also in the customize. But I think these tooling are generating just because of the things quite of complicated and will not come into the point that we met into the standards of how to, because there are so many different opinions how you can deploy to the cluster. But said,
Mhm.
Guy, it's been a wonderful question. Thank you for asking. And before I let you go, Michael, we know there's an ArgoCon. Argo has a huge community, the full event dedicated for the one technology. And because of so much tooling, so much integration, so many company behind it. So can you tell my audience like what is ArgoCon? And ArgoCon is I think held months ago. And first also on the top of what ArgoCon is and how your experience if you've been a part of it before or
So the first ArgoCon happened a couple years ago, and it was fully virtual. And I missed most of that because I had just started at Intuit and was busy trying to figure out, how to build Argo CD locally. But this last year we had a second ArgoCon, and it was on site in Mountain View, where Intuit is headquartered. And it was a lot of fun. So we had talks from people who have been involved in the different Argo projects for from the very beginning and had a lot of really deep insight into advanced Argo use cases. Something we were kind of surprised by is there were a lot of folks who just were getting introduced to Argo. And I think that if we do a next ArgoCon, we'll have a lot more beginner-focused material. There's discussion about whether it makes sense to continue to do ArgoCon as a standalone conference or whether it should be integrated with KubeCon or something else. So we'll see if that happens next year. But if it does, there will be a call for papers. You'll see it announced in CNCF Slack, and yeah, I hope we have another one. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think the Argo Con has been a. If you can go to this channel, you can watch all the ArgoCon 2022 highlights, and it's been a wonderful job. Some of the very inspiring how the people are using in Argo in so many different places. It's been extremely fascinating to see how people are using Argo CD, and everybody I see some of the tweets from the people. I can't even imagine how the different things can be done with the Argo CD. So it's been a wonderful. If you try to understand what's happening in the ecosystem around Argo, I think the Argo 2022 highlight is for you. Please free to join in and ask questions. And and also, Michael, if you go to the next and final slide, you can give up people a
Let's see, should I
brief
go all the way to
overview.
the end?
Yes, and one more, please. So I think we can see the Argo CD is a continuous delivery tool for Kubernetes, which uses declarative configuration, CRDs, and GitOps approach, and Argo CD automates the deployment of the desired application state in the specified target environment. So is a first key takeaway is a good for run, or do you want to add something into it?
I think that's pretty good. Argo CD is kubectl, but way more powerful, and it does GitOps for you.
Yes, and there are four quadruples also in place for the Argo. But the Argo rollout, I try to explain here, is a Kubernetes controller set of CRDs which provide advanced deployment capabilities such as blue-green, canary releases, experimentation, progressive delivery, feature to Kubernetes, and both projects aim to make it easier for developer to deploy and release application on Kubernetes. And this supports the initial stages of the you build it, you run it approach that is becoming increasingly common within cloud native organization. I think that's the part. So I think one of my favorite too, because it's a good question to ask here is Argo rollout has been my favorite part because I want to do some canary deployment or these kind of activities. It's very wonderful you can do these kind of activities. Apart from the quadruple, where you spend most of your time, what is your favorite one?
Oh, of the four, what's my favorite?
Yes.
Oh, so Argo workflows will always have a special place in my heart because it's where I started with Argo, and I used it to replace a really kind of crummy custom system written in Scala. So I really see the benefits and the problem that it solves. I love working with Argo workflows. I've played with writing some plugins recently. Uh, I mean, I work on CD all day, and it's extremely powerful, and I love that it touches so many systems, and I get to learn a lot with it. So those are where my where my heart is the most. But they're all fantastic products. And I should mention, Argo Rollouts is actually being worked on a lot by someone I worked with at Bayer. So Zach Aller is taken up maintaining it. I think probably the primary developer at this point. Extremely talented dev. So look for rollouts to really get a lot of great features and improvements soon. And also Leo Almeida from Intuit is working on it, and excellent devs. So expect great things there.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And we discussed a lot of things, and we try to, and this is the thing I think we need to mention here. There is a series of web UIs for the Argo, and that's great thing because you can visualize how the Argo workflow runnings, how the rollouts are running. You can see all this information in the dashboard, and make it easier for the developer to visualize and understand deployment progress and the related issues. And many of the tasks that are typically accomplished by the Kubernetes CLI can be automated or triggered via web-based UI. I think Argo has a
Mhm.
wonderful UI. It's been a very popular one, and so many good things in here. So I think it's packed. Argo is not just a one thing. It's understand for the industry need so many different things like CI/CD. They need web UI, the triggers, the workflow, the progressive delivery, the canary releases. So I think it's a packed. So it's impossible for us to cover all these detail in just one go. But I think with Michael did a wonderful analysis of all these kind of activities. So we will be leaving here today, but Michael, we will planning our workshop as well. So be ready for this because I want some people to see some cool demos for this. So before I let you go, because we are closing down the year, any new plans before we close down the year for the Argo? Any big release or new feature?
So Argo CD 2.6 is going to have a number of pretty big features. One is progressive rollouts in application sets. So it just automates moving deployments through different environments, for example, dev to test to prod. It's also going to have the ability to pull in individual application sources from multiple sources of truth. And that's huge because you'll be able to deploy a standard community-based Helm repository, but with a custom values file that is managed in your own private Git repository. And that's by far the most requested Argo CD features. So 2.6 is going to be a big one for a lot of people.
Yes, absolutely. This is the feature requested a lot. I see a lot of this on the Twitter that people have requested this kind of feature. It's a great thing. And I'm looking forward to the 2.6 as well. And thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure talking to you on this show. And before I leave everyone, here's a website for you if you want to learn more about the Argo. Here's a repository where you can see all the quadruple Argo CD projects. And it's a tutorial from, I think, Tech Word with Nana, Argo CD tutorial for beginner. And another one on the GitOps by Solomon Iqbal, he's a friend of mine and very wonderful trainer around cloud native technologies. And the list is absolutely beautiful on the ArgoCon 2020. And I think encourage everyone to spend time on learning from these talks how you can use Argo. And Argo CD's repository is also listed here. And his work on the Intuit. And if you want to learn more about what Intuit is, here's a website for you to go and explore. And Argo workflow and pipeline from the DevOps Toolkit channel. It's been a 17, 18-minute video, but it depicts a lot of good things. And Argo rollout is also from the DevOps Toolkit channel. And this video, Argo Events Deep Dive, it's available on the Argo YouTube channel. And there are so many wonderful content available on the Argo CD YouTube channel. Will be added this on the YouTube chat, so you can grab a link and enjoy learning resources as well. And once again, thank you very much, Michael. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Hope to have you again in another episode because the Argo is been a very favorite project for everyone. So we will keep interrupting you for the future as well. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye bye.